Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to another episode of Security, Intelligence, and Terrorism series. My guest for today is someone who has been a person who served in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, mostly involved in counterterrorism and human intelligence operations in Canada and abroad. Upon retirement from government service, he joined BlackBerry's Government Relations Division and established a team to lead BlackBerry's strategic relationship with law enforcement, intelligence, and security agencies around the globe on national security, sensitive criminal investigation, cybercrime, and other regulatory issues, mainly focused on lawful access concern. Al Treddenick is the CEO of Acno Group, a public safety and risk consultancy company. Al, thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, before starting, let's get one thing straight. A lot of people might be asking in the comment section, do you still hire for CSIS?
That's you'd have to direct that question at the service. I'm sure they are.
But you aren't hiring anyone.
Well, my group isn't hiring anyone, but the federal government is always looking for people, so I imagine they're hiring.
Okay, so now that we have addressed the elephant in the room, we can move on to the larger questions. So we have spoken to people who are analysts, and a lot of people in our chat is like, well, they're boring people because they just sit behind a computer and get things done. Let's talk to people who are actually on the field, who are field officers, and let's listen to their side of the story and how they gather intelligence, recruit sets of sources, and analyze information received. So, what is like to be a field officer is my first question. What's the roles and responsibilities?
Sure. We're probably just as boring as your audience thinks the analysts are, and I wouldn't say the analysts are boring. I mean, they see all the source information and are able to put everything together. But for the field operatives, we're basically just collectors. We're collectors of information. And we provide the information to the analysts to put it all together. And most of the time it's human operations. So whatever information is derived from human source operations. And we're also able to provide feedback to the analysts on information that we get, the intangibles that analysts might not get from open source information or technical information or other means, such as, is a target just full of hot air, or is this target really a target that's going to do something? Things like that, right? That sort of intangible stuff. And also when we provide that information from the field and the analysts take that, they can come back and often do come back to the field operatives to say, well, there's a gap here, there's a gap there in the information, or need clarification on some of the information provided. And that's where the field operatives go back and talk to their sources or develop new sources to fill those gaps and to get the clarifications required.
Yeah. So let me come back to your personal journey a little bit and then probably move on to the other questions. So you're a graduate of Queen's University and then you went to the Canadian Police College. Where all this started? Was it you wanted to be in the intelligence service, or you wanted to be in the federal agency for a very long time, or were you recruited out of college?
No, actually what happened was I joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to be a Mountie and do policing for your audience that don't don't know much about the RCMP, they are Canada's federal police, but they also provide provincial policing and municipal policing. So like your state police and municipal police as well, under contract for those places that can't afford to have their offices. So basically the MP is the provincial municipal force in about 10 of the provinces and 3 of the territories. There's only really 3 provinces that have their own provincial police. And in those provinces, for the most part, the RCMP just does federal policing like drugs, counterterrorism, that sort of stuff, organized crime, things like that. So I joined to be a policeman out in uniform and do that sort of work. And my education had been in political science, so and terrorism had always interested me. And I had subsequently applied to the security service. At that time, it was under the RCMP, and was accepted. Went into it, and then the government separated it to form a civilian agency called the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in 1984. And the CSIS, which is the acronym, took over the counterterrorism, counterintelligence, foreign interference mandates. Now, CSIS just collects information, doesn't do the prosecutions. We collect information for the government, and then the government will act on that information if they so choose. And that one of the actions they can take is prosecutions, in which case the information will go to the RCMP or the police force of jurisdiction, and then a prosecution takes place, or their investigation takes place. So I ended up in CSIS for most of my service, and you're correct, it was mostly counterterrorism related, mostly domestic, but also abroad. And just before I retired, I was in Saudi Arabia and Yemen for 5 years.
Yeah, and I think you're mentioning about the province. I think only Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland have their own province, provincial police, if I'm not wrong, right?
That's correct. Newfoundland's a bit of a hybrid in that the RCMP works with the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary to police the province. So yeah, it's sort of a hybrid there. But you're right, in Ontario and Quebec, they have strictly their own provincial police.
So the role of RCMP is very limited in that aspect. Only with regards to counterterrorism or drug and trafficking that you're talking about, it's only that
any federal statute, right? Any federal statute in those provinces, right?
Yeah. So now I'll come to CSIS as well in some time. So RCMP has their own probably branch of their operations as well, as the CSIS will also have a division for carrying out operation. But Canada does not have its own external intelligence agency like the US has, right? So does the role of CSIS or RCMP clash in terms of operational basis, or are they well defined?
No, as I mentioned, the CSIS collects information and does the analysis, provides that analysis and the information to law enforcement when there's grounds to believe that there's a criminal offense being committed or will be committed, and then the RCMP takes over that investigation and conducts a criminal investigation. So they're responsible for that end, for the prosecution end of it. CSIS will continue to monitor say if it's a specific target, we'll monitor the activities of that target from an intelligence point of view. Whereas the police will continue a sort of a similar investigation at the same time, but they're collecting evidence. CSIS doesn't collect evidence, collects information. So there's a lower threshold for CSIS to start investigations. The RCMP will collect their evidence, provide it to the Crown attorneys, the prosecution service, and then it goes from there to the court, possibly.
Okay. So let's come back to now the main topic that we are trying to discuss. It's about, let's talk about how does a field officer work? What's its primary work you define? But tell us about how does one gather intelligence from the field? What's the process?
Okay, sure. So it can depend on whether you're collecting domestically or abroad, and whether when I say abroad, whether it's a denied environment or conflict zones. So CSIS is mainly a security service. Its main operations are domestic, much like MI5 in the UK. But it does have, under the CSIS Act, can investigate threats to national security anywhere in the world. So there can be investigations done abroad in various countries, and obviously Afghanistan's one of them, where our troops were deployed. So there are times when CSIS will fulfill that aspect of it. You're correct. Canada currently doesn't have a strictly foreign intelligence agency that's human-oriented. But that's why I say CSIS can fulfill that role from time to time as circumstances require. So how does a field operative work? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to develop your own networks. And you develop those networks to identify access to targets. And the targets are identified it starts with the federal government having their priorities, right? Their national security priorities, and they communicate those down to the headquarters. Headquarters takes a look at that, brings in all sorts of information. And that's where the analysts come in, and they have sort of a general picture, and then they'll identify where there's gaps or requirements for collection to be done. And they'll communicate those to the field officers. And then the field officers will go out there and be able to do the collection based on those requirements. But you start with your networks first. And so when I say you start with your networks first, it's just about anybody who you come in contact with could be a potential asset for you, if not immediately, certainly potentially down the road for other investigations maybe. And the asset being for, say, access or tangential information on your targets, things like that. So you kind of start off with the network. So it's very important that you get out there and you meet people, and you're always thinking, field operators are always thinking sources. So human sources. So you are collecting in your mind when you're talking to people, who they are, who their family is, where they work, what their interests are, what activities they're involved in, and all that goes up here. And at some point, you never know, you may be working a target that is going to, say, frequents place X, and then you've met somebody 3 years ago that is goes to place X, or is part of place X's executive, or a member of X, that sort of thing. You know what I'm talking about on the connections there. And then you go to them and start talking to them, and you sort of develop them. It's kind of like concentric circles, right? Where the target is in the middle, and then for each circle around it, you start off with family and friends as the smallest circle, and close friends, and then you've got close friends and acquaintances, neighbors, the next circle, and then beyond that would be co-workers and casual acquaintances, things like that. So you kind of develop that network, you capitalize on that network, and you look for opportunities that people may have information that you're seeking. So that's how it starts, with the talent spotting, right? Yeah. And really, so the keys to success are really, at least for myself and in my experience, there's basically four things, right? There's the nose for someone who has something to trade and has the ability and willingness to deliver that. It doesn't have to be the target, it can be anybody that has the access. The ability to perceive and lock onto those qualities. so that's what you have to be able to do as a field operative. You've got to be able to read people and know that these people have a willingness to provide that service, right? Or you develop that in them, right? So we can get into that, developing the relationship. There's knowing precisely what will serve your purposes, who will serve your purposes for that job at hand. So if I need access to target X, or I need access to target X's family, or target X's coworker, or whatever, I have to know where to go. And that's the other thing. It's knowing your area. So it's knowing the cultures. It's of the targets you're working, knowing their interests. It's knowing their families, backgrounds, as much as you can. So and that's when you can get in the recruitment. The recruitment, you have to have a plan for the recruitment. If you don't have a plan, a really good plan, the chances of success are not as great as if you have a really good plan, right? You can fly by the seat of your pants, and sometimes it works, but a good plan is always good to have. So that's kind of it. It's like, it's kind of like fishing. If you have a pond and you have to know where the fish congregate, you can't see them, but you have to know, okay, that they're over in that corner of the pond or the corner of that lake. I know they go there. So that's where you throw out your line, and you throw it into where the fish congregate. So, but on that line, you have to have the right lure, the right bait, right, to catch the fish. So that's the other thing. That's why you need to know the area that you're working. If you don't know the area you're working, you're at a huge disadvantage.
I remember this reference of fishing to getting one's source recruited, as one of the other intelligence officer mentioned in my show. And he wasn't a field officer, so I didn't bother him asking this question, but I will bother you asking this. When you're fishing, right, and there are two people with the same intention of catching those fishes, but it depends who puts the bait first, right? So you and the other agency comes from a foreign agency to ask the same person to do the same thing, and who puts the larger money out there, or thread gets the source. Is there a danger associated with it, because it can flip anytime, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's right. I mean, it's a competitive market out there, put it that way. So there has to be some coordination from allied services, right, on that, because we don't want to be two allied services paying the same source for the same information. That makes no sense. So you have to have that coordination, but there are other agencies out there who are not the allied ones that are seeking the same information, and that's always a challenge. And it's not always money that's a motivating factor, right? There's a number of other motivating factors that sources work, and it's all part of the field operative's job to, once you've identified, from what I was talking about in the talent spotting, an access agent. And I'm not saying that we're going after the target at the moment. This is that we're going after an access agent. So you've got to figure out what motivates that person. Would it be money? Is it, ideological? Is it revenge? Is it, to eliminate a competitor? Is it, there's all sorts of, there's some main motivating factors that why people cooperate with the state. Fear can be one, but it's not a long-term. It's a very powerful motivator, but it's not long-term, just because of human nature. So really, you have to develop that relationship, and whoever develops that relationship first and better usually ends up with the source. And you need a good relationship to get into good tasking of the source. So making them productive and useful, and moving the operations forward.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a good quote. I've got a quote here. The most important secret of a salesmanship is to find out what the other fellow wants and then help him find the best way to get it. That's actually out of a salesman's handbook and it really is relevant to the field operator's job, and just as much as it is to a salesman of a good, right, of a good or a service. The field operator does the same thing. But what you're doing is you're selling yourself and you're selling your government, and you're trying to get the individual to, once you've identified them as an access or as the target, putting on what I call the Team Canada jersey, right? I've got to convince that individual why they should cooperate with Canada, why it's in their best interests, why they should do it. And that's where the challenge comes in, when you zero right down to the target of the investigation, and you want to recruit that target because that target could provide information on the bigger group, like Al Qaeda, for instance, or ISIS. Why that person should put on the Team Canada jersey, because it's a lot of risk for that individual if they were found out, right? So it's the job for the field operative is to figure that out, figure what motivates that individual. So you've got to figure out what the currency is. That's not always money. And then once you figured that out, you've got to figure out how much of that currency, whatever it is required for this individual to put on the Team Canada jersey and start doing, the good stuff, like being a good guy instead of a bad guy.
Yeah. So now, for instance, this guy decides to flip the other way around, and he tries to be a double agent. How do you figure that out? That he might be using your information to give it to someone else, and he's giving the other side information to you. So how do you figure that out?
Okay, so you're not giving your sources much information. You don't give them operational information. You give them as much as they need to move forward, to fill in gaps, things like that. So they'll get to know, what you're interested in. But you don't give them anything. You don't give the crown jewels to the sources, right? And that's for the analysts. The analysts get the crown jewels. The sources don't. So it's not so much as worrying that they'll flip on you and provide all, your enemy with all the information. You have to be aware that sources do that, where they will, if not cooperate with 2 agencies or 3 agencies or 4, or even flip completely. As long as you're aware of that and you're able to detect verbal, nonverbal indications as the relationship develops. Plus, don't forget their information is always being assessed against other information coming in. So whether it's other human sources from anywhere else in the world, or other technical information, or other open source information, allied information, all that's being reassessed by the analysts at headquarters, who will then be able to spot, hey, there's something funny here. And then they can communicate that down to the field operative, and then the field operative takes that and is then you would use that in your debriefings of the source to try and figure out, why is the source doing that, and try to stop that. Now, depending on what your goal is, you might end up feeding false information to the source, just so that gets back to your enemies. But there's ways to detect if a source is not, if the fidelity is not there to the source handler. And a lot of it depends on the relationship. And again, it depends on the motivations of the source. And the motivations for when a source starts to cooperate, that motivation isn't always present through the whole course of the relationship. Motivational aspects are fluid. And the field operative has to be able to read that in the person they're dealing with, in that human interaction, right? You have to be able to read the motivation of that source to be able to capitalize on the opportunities and move the operation forward, and to protect you as the source handler, but also to protect the source as they're moving, because sometimes sources can be over exuberant and try to please their controller or their handler by taking the extra step, which could affect their security. So you've got to be able to kind of, dial that down a bit, dial that enthusiasm down a little bit, and patience is always a good thing when you're dealing with human sources, because they can be, to me, they're the gold of an intelligence service as a human source, but they're also the most problematic because it's just human nature. So the source handler is always dealing with you become not only the idea is to become not only their friend or brother or father figure, or you end up becoming marriage counselor, family therapist, you name it, and they become dependent on you. But that's also a tool that's used, right, to develop that relationship by having them become more dependent on you.
Yeah. And
it's a trust thing too. So
yeah, I mean, I have a similar question regarding that, because now let's this is a part that probably, let's bring any motion picture that you see around, and a lot of these concepts come about for intelligence officers dealing with national security. And for example, I have read the C6 Act, and I think the Section 12 mentioned this very clearly, that CCs cannot arrest or detain any person. It can, I think the very word that was mentioned out there, it's I think the two words were "shall report to" and "advise" in that entire act, and to the government of Canada, of course. So it's just a collector of intelligence and shares that intelligence to other government agencies, but it cannot arrest. So, as a field officer, can you interrogate someone, uh, probably with unwarranted interrogation?
well, I wouldn't call it an interrogation. I mean, the intelligence officer is, you're trying to build relationships. Interrogations do not build relationships, right? They're just fact-finding interviews, and generally it's a adversarial relationship. When you call it an interrogation, it's adversarial in nature. So the field operatives in an intelligence service or a security service are out there to develop relationships. So it's a matter of being approachable, being a good listener, being aware of the issues, of why an individual is doing things, or intending to do things, or contemplating doing things, or anybody who has access, that you want their cooperation. And the only way you're going to get cooperation is to develop that relationship. And that's why I said it was so important to be able to know the customs, it also helps to know the language. You got to know your area. You have to know what the issues are, both if you're a security service in Canada, but you also have to know what the issues are, where the individual comes from, if they're from another country. And it's all about a dialogue. With intelligence officers, it's all about a dialogue and building a trusted relationship. And once you've got that built, then you can start turning it into a tasking, where you can direct the individual to provide information to you, and they don't feel bad doing it. And that's the other thing. You've got to kind of reshape their reality, in that they thought they were doing good for ISIS, say. You have to be able to kind of reshape that reality to show them why they should, or the reality is that they should be helping Canada out, for instance, to save, to save lives and things like that. That's the challenge, but you can't do it strictly through interrogations. Now, to get to your point, under the CSIS Act, now nothing prevents CSIS officer from going and talking to anybody. You can talk to anybody, right? Now, is that person compelled to talk to you? No. So even more so, you need to develop that that ability to go and talk to them and build that relationship and build that trust. So there's been times where I've had in the past where I've gone to talk to people and they've basically shut the door on me, but doesn't mean I've stopped there. You know, I may see them on the street and just, hey, how you doing? You know, like, remember me? You want to go for a coffee yet? You know, that sort of thing. So it's, I mean, there's nothing preventing the service from talking to anybody. It's the same with the police. The police can talk to anybody. And what happens though is once you start an interrogation, it's adversarial, and the cooperation there, it's harder to get, and it's a shorter term. The intelligence officer in the field officers are out for long-term recruitments. Sure, there are times when they're short-term, when the circumstances dictate that you have to move really quickly. But for the most part, your goal is to have a long-term penetration, and to do that, you have to build a strong relationship. If it's not a strong relationship, it's not going to last. It won't last through the different things that a human source goes through personally, but it also won't last security-wise.
Yeah. So another myth that we see in in films: can you fly a plane? Can you use a gun? And at the same time, can you go and blow up cities at your own will?
No,
All at
absolutely
once.
not. Can I fly a plane? I don't have a pilot's license. Can I shoot a gun? Yes, I can shoot a gun. I have qualifications on firearms. Do I carry them? No, they're not carried as a rule in CSIS. On the policing side, yes, they're in Canada and the United States, they're armed. Well, basically because they have police powers and their peace officer status, so they may have to intervene in circumstances where intelligence officers don't have to intervene on something. So, and basically the intelligence officer is trying to stay in the shadows, right? You're not, you don't want to be out there on the forefront and arrest somebody under a citizen's arrest because you're going to have to appear in court, and then it's, you know, you don't want to be doing that. Your usefulness will diminish. So you're getting to the movies and the books and things that James Bond does, and no, it's far more mundane than that. It's there's a lot of preparation that goes into when you're doing anything. You can read about it in actual books, factual books from some cases from the UK. We haven't done too many that I'm aware of in Canada, but you'll see a lot of books from the United States and the UK where they're former intelligence officers, and they'll go into some of the tradecraft that's used before meetings and debriefings and stuff. And there's a lot of planning that goes into that. Again, it depends on where you are. So if you're in a denied environment, such as working in the Soviet Union or in China, just for instance, or if you go to a conflict zone like Afghanistan or Somalia, you have to plan every move of what you're doing for your own safety, but also your source's security and safety. So it can be pretty mundane in that it takes a long time to plan these things. It takes a long time to, fill out your plan and send it to headquarters to get the okay. Looks good, and you go and do it. You might take you a couple of days or maybe a week to fill out a plan to meet the source for 15 minutes, and then you go back, you write up your report or whatever it is you're doing, you send that to headquarters, and then get ready for the next one, which might be in another month or 2 months, or it might be next week, right? But you're sitting around, you're behind a desk like an analyst, only you're writing up your operational plan on how you're going to meet or debrief that source. So are we jumping out of planes? No. Do we have fast fast vehicles like an Aston Martin? No. That shoot out oil and have machine guns in the front and rockets in the back? No. No, pretty quiet stuff. And that's the way you want it. You want to be able to motor around in those environments. You need situational awareness just to protect yourself. So you have to know where you're going and what you're getting into ahead of time. So it's for your own security, but also once the operation starts, it's for the source of security and safety as well.
Yeah. So now let's come to a part that I really want to ask, since you have worked both in RCMP and CSIS. So there has been established after post 9/11, there have been the integrated national security enforcement teams post 9/11, where there has been representatives of the RCMP federal partners and agencies. And we have seen as well the RCMP coordinates with CSIS on various matters of national security, traditional counterterrorism. But the larger point, what I'm trying to ask is, so why doesn't CSIS and RCMP carry out joint operations?
So you mentioned the INSETs, the integrated teams. CSIS actually has a secondment into those teams. We have intelligence officers in those teams. So there is quite a bit of cooperation, goes back and forth, and collaboration. But as I mentioned before, CSIS collects information. We don't collect evidence. The INSETs collect evidence. So the challenge for CSIS in doing a joint operation with the RCMP is the ability to be able to provide information that's collected, so intelligence that the police can use for evidence, or the Crown can use for evidence. That's always been a challenge. It remains a challenge in Canada. We're trying to develop new ways of doing that because our courts demand quite a bit of disclosure from the Crown, from the state, from the prosecution. So CSIS tries to protect its sources and methods, and it's hard to do that when you provide information for evidence because the defense then has the ability to request disclosure. They don't always get it, but they can request it. So it's a threat to the methods and sources that CSIS has. We do collaborate very closely with the RCMP, or at least in my time in CSIS we did, and it works well. I mean, there are hiccups from time to time, but it does work reasonably well, especially after 9/11. And could it work better? Sure. Could we, the politicians come up with a new legislation that would stand the test of our Supreme Court and our Charter of Rights? I think they should be trying. Much like the UK model, if we could kind of go down that route. But I've been out of it for a while, so nobody really listens to me on that end.
Yeah, I get that. You retired in 2012, right? As you were mentioning yesterday.
2012, yeah.
Well, that's not a huge gap. It's just like 9 years back.
Well, right. Things haven't changed that much. The threat environment hasn't changed that much. It's still really counterterrorism focused. There is more emphasis now being put on counter espionage and foreign interference in Canada because we're seeing an uptake in that, as you probably have as well. And I would see resources being devoted to that. The field officers working those areas are basically follow the same route. You've got a talent spot. First of all, you have to know where to go. And then you have to talent spot for individuals that have access, and from there to the sources, and then identifying what motivates those particular sources or potential sources, which would motivate them for a successful recruitment. So it's basically the tools are the same. The threat may be a little different. As I said, overseas, you need more operational situational awareness just to protect yourself and your sources. But for domestic you still need situational awareness, but it's not as crucial as when operating in a denied environment or a conflict zone.
Yeah. And now this is a very popular two terms we have heard, especially post 9/11. One is a targeter, the another is a case officer. So, what are the two work of these kinds of field officer? If you could explain a little bit for our audience.
You mean a targeting officer?
Yeah, a targeting officer or case officer. What does these two officers do on the
Okay.
field?
So really, it depends on your organization. Not every organization has enough people that they can say, you're designated this, you're designated that in this particular case. From the CSIS point of view, if you're a case officer, you're basically the source handler. That's your case, right? You're responsible for all aspects of maintaining and that operation from a human source point of view, all the administrative requirements and the tasking and all that. A targeting officer is more one who provides all the information needed that would assist the case officer to progress that investigation. So that could be, so in CSIS case, just they're not the source handler, but they're an investigator on that unit. The investigator would then be able to pull together information from various other sources, similar to what the analyst does, but more from a tactical point of view, so that they would assist the case officer in maximizing the usefulness of the source or identifying recruitment indicators on individuals and that. So it's basically following up the leads and providing those leads to the case officers or the source handlers to utilize as they need. So it's very much a team effort. It's not a one-shot go like you see in James Bond, right? The only team he really has is Q, because Q provides him with all the gadgets. I personally, in my experience, have not had 1/100th of the gadgets James Bond has had. Most of the time, it's just a cell phone. That's what you've got.
I am 100% sure that will be a little boring for all those people of your audience who expected you could fly planes, ride a car, go with machine guns.
Yeah, that's the common misconception, but it's great for Hollywood, but not doesn't really happen in real life. There are a few movies out there that are fairly accurate, but there's more that aren't. And whether they're movies or television series, you have to kind of take them with a grain of salt. They're entertaining, and cases normally don't run 90 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever the episode is. They can tend to be a long time, similar to the recruitments. Recruitments can take a long time. That's why I say patience usually wins out, and you just can't rush things. And I've been involved in recruitments that have happened quickly, but more often than not, I've been involved more when the longest one was over a couple of years.
Well, that's a long period of waiting time.
Well, it's not just waiting; it's developing the relationship. So it's right. So from the start till the individual was a productive asset was 2 years.
Yeah. Now let's come to your stint at Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And I'll ask you one opening question and probably move to that. So what's your experience of working as an RCMP officer in Canada and going out there in Riyadh and working on foreign soil? So if you could explain a little bit of difference operating on home soil and abroad and the limitations.
Well, absolutely. I mean, working as an RCMP officer in Canada, you're doing the policing. You're doing policing work, right? Now the RCMP does have liaison offices in various cities around the globe that deal with the police forces of those countries. Much like India, there's RCMP liaison officers in India. From an intelligence officer's point of view, that depends on whether you're actively involved in operations in conflict zones or denied areas. Then if you're just operating as a liaison post in certain countries, much like the RCMP does, right? Only the CSIS officers at that point would be having relationships with, say, the IB and RA in India, that sort of thing, right? It's all liaison offices. If you're doing operations, it gets to be, that's where you need situational awareness. You have to know what you're doing. And it's very much team sport. It's teamwork to keep everybody safe and secure. Operating in Saudi Arabia was good. The Saudi Ministry of the Interior and the Mabath, which is basically their security service, or was their security service till recently, were excellent. They were, for the most part, a lot of the senior elements were Western trained and Western educated. So they understood what we were trying to do as the West against Al-Qaeda and extremist elements. They were also doing the same thing because they were those elements were potentially destabilizing, Middle Eastern governments and monarchies. So they were exceptionally good and professional. Enjoyed working in Saudi Arabia. Yemen was a different case. Again, now when I was operating, I was declared a declared intelligence officer, so everybody knew who I was. There you had to be more careful just because of the environment. It was basically a conflict zone. But again, their National Security Bureau at the time was good, and there was a lot of liaison back and forth, and they appreciated our efforts to assist them in what they were trying to do. And same as the Saudis, there was good cooperation back and forth on the counterterrorism front. So it was good. I mean, but you still have to have that operational awareness and situational awareness in whatever environment you're in.
Yeah.
And I have a good story for you from Yemen. I mean, so after 2010, the US Embassy had been attacked by Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And the operatives breached the essential staff from all their embassies at that time, right after that attack. Now, I happened to be there during that time, and I was walking through, I was going to meet a friend, and I was walking through what is the main souk in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. And it was a tourist attraction before all the troubles in Yemen. And it's one of the biggest souks and oldest souks in the Middle East. As I was walking through, I mean, I look like a Westerner, right? I was dressed I have short hair. I had a goatee at the time. I was wearing a golf shirt. I had tactical sunglasses on, and I had some khaki tactical pants. And so I was walking through the souk, which I'd done hundreds of times before. And there were two young guys, young Yemenis. I'd say they'd be in their early 20s. And they were standing beside one of the stalls. And as I was walking by, I was watching them through my sunglasses. So they couldn't really see that I was looking at them, but they probably knew I was watching. And one of the young guys did this. And as I was walking by, I just looked at him and I said in Arabic, "I'm an American," bang, 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 bang. And they kind of looked, and then they laughed and I laughed, but I kept walking. And I'll tell you, I got out of there. And because you could disappear in that souk and nobody would ever find you. And I was able to get out fairly quickly and get to a safe spot. So you have to be aware of what you're doing and where you are. So there's that concern. So that's why the situational awareness is so important in some of these places. So there's a story for you. Analysts don't get to tell you that story. I do.
Now, you can choose to answer as briefly or probably not spilling a lot of beans discussion. But let me ask you about when you're operating, and for example, in Saudi, and you do not have the same amount of freedom as you have in your own country, right? Because you're not a citizen, you probably come as a diplomat. You don't even come as intelligence or declared intelligence officer at places. So if you meet, and not all the information that you collect needs to be shared with the intelligence officers in Saudi as well. So even though you enjoy a little bit of diplomatic impunity, but is there a thin line that you need to maintain that when you meet your sources, the other person, the other group does not know, because they might be monitoring your movements as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you
And
see
is there a
that in
story
books.
that you had to cross somewhere
Yeah.
secretly?
I'm not going to cross any lines, but I'll tell you, you need the cooperation to be really effective. You need the cooperation with the host governments, and you need to have a good relationship with them. So that takes time to develop, right? They have to trust you. You have to trust them, and some governments are better than others, and when we collect information, and I'll just say this from the Canadian point of view, when CSIS collects information, we collect information based on the requirements of the Canadian government. So whether that information is shared with anybody, that would depend on whether it was in Canada's interest to share it.
Do you have a nail-biting story that you were nearly caught collecting information or something out straight out of a movie scene type?
No.
So it's absolutely fine treading the lines.
Right, that's right. You have to know how far you can go, and that's why I say it's a lot of it has to do with the relationships you develop, not only with your human sources, but with your host security agencies. And we're all trying to do the same job, and that's to protect our people. And so are there times when they would prefer you not talking to people? Sure, but then my hope would be that they would come and say, please don't talk to those individuals anymore, or something like that. But you have to deconflict wherever you are, but you have to go where the information is. So that's where you go. And if that information isn't forthcoming from a foreign government, then you're going to go in there and get it yourself. So it's or you can help them, right? Or they can help you. I mean, it all depends on relationships.
So information has been collected, even though there was a notification of not being it's just not you or the Canadian government, but intelligence officers do go and collect information, even though they are asked not to collect by the host country.
Well, if you do that, then you're really risking some diplomatic issues on that. So if somebody says don't do that, then you probably shouldn't do that.
Okay, I won't ask you more on that. Let's moving on about covert operations of how does an intelligence officer has to prepare or gather intelligence to carry out a covert operation that I mean, officially Canada does not carry out any operation in a foreign country. Like the US has impunity, gets to do that a lot of time. But in case you have to carry out a covert operation for the interest of your country, what are the things that you need to keep in mind?
Well, that's where it becomes more challenging, especially in today's world with facial recognition, et cetera, right? Your covert operations are fraught with danger. And danger in that it's exposure of the operation. Not necessarily is it a danger personally to yourself and in any way, but it can be depending on the environment you're in and the country you're in. But it takes a lot of planning, a lot of preparation. That's definitely one you can't do on the fly. You can't do it, what I would call half-assed. It's got to be well planned and well executed on the covert stuff. Does covert collection occur? Sure, it occurs. As you've mentioned, right? There's countries that do it and do it all the time. And it is the second oldest profession, they say, spying. So, it's going to go on, and it'll continue to go on, regardless of the technological advances like facial recognition and biometrics and things. That just makes it more difficult. So it's the challenge of intelligence and security agencies to figure out how do we do those operations given these technological challenges. So that's about as far as I can say on that.
So let me just ask one question. I think you've answered this as well while you're in an interview with Phil. And I will put that link there. I won't tread much into that because you've already discussed. I'll put the link for Phil's video that you have recorded. But I mean, we have, especially a couple of days back, there's I think an article came in Washington Post, and it spoke about how this entire case of a Saudi spy being trying to be assassinated by MBS, and how it ended up, and there's this court case going on. So how bad is foreign interference in Canada? One, and what, as a field officer, what are the things that you need to keep in mind when somebody sends Tiger Squad to assassinate a person living in Canada?
So that's the challenge, right? Is foreign interference going on? Absolutely. What would take to combat that? As I've mentioned before, Canada needs, similar to what the Americans have, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. That's a start. What do field officers have to keep in mind? It's the same investigative tools and methods as you would investigate counterterrorism. So there's not really a change there. You just have to be aware of what your target area is, like who's doing the foreign interference and what's their goals. So what's their goals and who are their targets. As far as the hit teams coming to Canada, that's one where you want to be able to identify when they're coming, who they are when they're coming, and that gets passed to the police, the RCMP, and our border officials to keep them out and or prosecute. So it becomes a criminal offense at that point.
And like it's unlikely, but if we all remember the case, what happened with Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, the American Saudi citizen who went to Istanbul and he went to the embassy and didn't come out.
Right.
Of how much espionage is required, or how much as a field officer you need to keep in mind that one Saudi Canadian citizen doesn't have the same fate of going to the embassy and not coming out, and the blame entirely comes to the Canadian government for not being careful of embassies operating in their own soil.
Well, you would hope that they would have their own situational awareness and wouldn't be going, if they're a target and they know they're a target, they wouldn't be going to the embassies or the consulates in Canada. At the same point, the Canadian government needs to be making representation, whether publicly or more likely through the foreign affairs offices, to the offending government to say, we know what you're doing, stop, or there will be consequences, whether that's declaring intelligence officers or diplomats persona non grata, or sanctions, economic sanctions, whatever, depending on the gravity of the offense. But that's a political decision. And as far as the field operative, same thing applies. It's the same investigation. So are you trying to develop information on foreign spies operating in your country? Well, that's what the security services do.
Yeah. Last question before I let you go. I'll probably use a couple of minutes. So you're currently on the Joint Cyber Council for the Canadian Advanced Technology Association, and you also member in the International Association of Chief of Police and the Society for Policing of Cyberspace. So that's a lot of that's a lot on your CV. And this is the part that I didn't tell in the beginning of introduction, because it's what I want to end with, of how a lot of Chinese, for example, the 5G technology that has been uh, installed and the towers have been made. Uh, how much is the intelligence agency concerned of their citizen not being spied? Because that's a very unlikely, because I mean, there's a very likely incident, because we have seen what happened with the rest of the places of China spying on its own citizens living in foreign countries. So what's your assessment of this, and how much are the intelligence agency working on this at the moment?
So as well, in Canada and the United States have both come out and publicly stated that this activity has been going on by the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, the director of CSIS recently came out and identified both China and Russia as conducting these types of operations. So I assume that the investigations into that or those activities are ongoing by the security services of all the Western countries. What do I think of it? I think it's a direct threat. You're right. They do have it's an autocratic surveillance state in China. That's the way they've decided they want to run their society, and with the head of it being the Chinese Communist Party. And they want to try and export that to control their own citizens or anybody working with China. So we do have to keep that in mind. We do have to take these investigations seriously, and we have to interdict when those issues come up, such as the 5G networks. We can't allow exposed networks that control our critical infrastructures, because that will then become a tactical advantage for any enemy should hostilities break out. So these are things that the governments have to take into account and take mitigating measures.
Yeah. So the point is clear as an intelligence agency or intelligence officer, that whatever fight is there, finish it off your backyard. Don't bring it to your country and carry it on as a battleground, because that becomes another set of problems.
Well, that's Canada, right? We're a country of immigrants. We welcome immigrants. Immigrants contribute enormously to Canadian culture and economics, and we will continue to do that. And the one thing the security services do monitor is any individual coming over and bringing homeland conflicts into Canada, and then either trying to conduct activities on behalf of those issues in Canada, and or traveling back to participate in, say, terrorist activities like ISIS and things like that. I mean, that's what the security services are all about, right? We're trying to protect the democracy in Canada and the life as we know it, and at the same time continue to welcome new immigrants. I mean, that's what Canada was made with. Same with the United States. So they're doing the same. The U.S. is doing the same thing, and it's you're right. You come over, you want to start a new life in Canada or the U.S., then you leave the homeland conflicts behind and you start a new life and contribute positively to the Canadian mosaic.
Yeah. So before I end, this is one thing that I've asked, like every intelligence officer that I've got on my show, probably end that with you. What's your 9/11 story? Where were you that time? Were you in the RCMP? Were you in the CSIS? Were you in the field? So there. And one last thing, which is if you can share one experience or one story from Saudi, which you can share it.
Okay. So after 9/11, when 9/11 happened, I was working in our Toronto field office. I was in charge of one of the units that investigated Al Qaeda, actually, before that. So right when 9/11 happened for about the next 48, 72 hours, I didn't get much sleep. So we were ramping up our investigative activities. So that's where I was in 9/11, with the CSIS, the field office, the Toronto field office, which is the biggest field office in CSIS. Stories on Saudi. All I can tell you is I had a good time there. It was professionally, it was great. I met a lot of good people not only from other countries through their embassies, etc., but also within the Saudi government. There were a lot of great people. Once the Saudis get to know you and trust you, and you maintain that trust, then it was a great place to be. Does it have its issues? Yes, it has its issues, but on the whole, it was a great place to do 5 years.
Yeah, well, you have maintained your ground of not speaking anything on Saudi, your experience, but thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. It's a pleasure hosting you, and I think you've disappointed and broken a lot of hearts who want to be in the intelligence service because of the James Bond actions that they thought they might get. But nevertheless, I think it's a wonderful profession, as you mentioned, and I think some people watching this might join an organization in their respective countries.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I've had a great career. It was very interesting. There were exciting times, not like James Bond, but it had its moments. So yeah, I would encourage anybody to take a look at joining their security or intelligence agencies in their countries. And thank you for having me on your show. It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed talking to you.
I hope my questions weren't boring you. I mean, by any chance,
Oh,
because
no. Not like Phil's.
Phil might be watching this.
Hi, Phil.
But anyways, thanks once again for taking your time. It's an honor hosting you.